How long were the Israelites in Egypt? In Exodus 12:40 it says, "Now the length of time the Israelite people lived in Egypt was 430 years. And so because of this, movies like the Ten Commandments will say things like this.
That's a hard dance you do, old man. We've been dancing it for 400 years.
400 years we have waited.
400 years in bondage, and today he won't move.
After 400 years of slavery.
And experts on the topic will say things like this.
The Israelites were there 430 years. We have the record in the Bible that tells about the Israelites going into Egypt and living there for 430 years.
But if you do the math, you'll find that this is not mathematically possible. You see, Moses was 80 years old when they left Egypt. His father Amram lived to 137. His father Kohath lived to 133. And Kohath was one of the 66 persons who went with Jacob down into Egypt. Now let's just stretch this out as much as we possibly can. Let's assume that Kohath was a newborn baby when he arrived in Egypt. Let's assume that Amram was born the year that his father died, and let's assume that Moses was born the year that his father died. So take 133 plus 137 plus 80, and that equals 350, which means that the amount of time the Israelites were in Egypt could have been no longer than 350 years maximum. Now, more than likely, Kohath was probably not a newborn baby when he arrived in Egypt. More than likely, Moses was not born the year that his father died, and more than likely, Amram was not born the year that his father died, which means that the amount of time the Israelites were in Egypt would have been significantly less than 350 years. So why does Exodus 12:40 say the Israelites were in Egypt for 430 years when this is not mathematically possible? The key is found in one of Paul's letters. In Galatians 3:16 and 17, Paul says, "Now to Abraham and his seed were the promises made. And this I say, that the law, which was 430 years later, cannot annul the covenant that was confirmed before by God in Christ." Basically, Paul is saying that from the time that Abraham received the promise to the time that Moses received the law, there was 430 years. Well, Abraham received the promise when he entered Canaan when he was 75 years old. Then, 25 years later, when Abraham was 100 years old, that's when Isaac was born. Then, 60 years later, when Isaac was 60 years old, that's when Jacob was born. Then, 130 years later, when Jacob was 130 years old, that's when all of Israel arrived in Egypt. So take 25 plus 60 plus 130, and that equals 215, which means that there was 215 years from the time that Abraham entered Canaan to the time that all of Israel arrived in Egypt. Now, Moses received the law at the same time that they left Egypt, because remember, the Israelites were living in Goshen, and then Moses led them out of Goshen, brought them through the wilderness, and brought them to the sea. And then God split the waters of the sea in half and brought them into Midian, which is in Arabia, then brought them to Mount Sinai, which is where Moses received the law. And so Moses received the law at the same time they left Egypt. So Paul is saying that there was 430 years from this point to this point, and according to the Old Testament, there's 215 years from this point to this point. So take 430 years and then subtract 215 years, and that equals 215, which means that the amount of time that the Israelites were in Egypt was 215 years. 215 in Egypt, 215 in Canaan, 430 total. Now that is mathematically possible, because 215 is significantly less than 350, and that's exactly what the Greek Septuagint says in Exodus 12:40. It says, "And the sojourning of the children of Israel while they sojourn in the land of Egypt and the land of Canaan was 430 years. The Samaritan Pentateuch says the same thing. It says, "Now the sojourning of the children of Israel and of their fathers, which they had dwelt in the land of Canaan and in Egypt, was 430 years. Flavius Josephus says they left Egypt 430 years after our forefather Abraham came into Canaan, but 215 years only after Jacob removed into Egypt. Flavius Josephus is saying the exact same thing. He's saying they left Egypt 430 years since our forefather Abraham came into Canaan, but 215 years only since Jacob removed into Egypt. Flavius Josephus is saying the exact same thing. So why do modern translations say that the Israelites were in Egypt for 430 years when this is not mathematically possible? The reason why is because modern translations like the New King James, the NIV, the NASB, these are all translated from the Hebrew Masoretic text. But the Hebrew Masoretic text is not the original Hebrew text. The copy of the Masoretic text that most modern translations are translated from is called the Leningrad Codex, which was copied in the 11th century AD. But the Greek Septuagint was translated more than 1,000 years before that in 250 BC, which means that the Greek Septuagint would not have been translated from the Hebrew Masoretic, but rather it would have been translated from a much older copy of the Hebrew that's no longer around today. The Samaritan Pentateuch also predates the Masoretic text and would also have been translated from a much older copy of the Hebrew. Flavius Josephus was a 1st century Jewish historian. He lived long before the Masoretic text was copied, and Josephus had access to ancient Hebrew texts that have since been lost or destroyed. Paul the Apostle lived long before the Masoretic text was copied, and Paul knew Hebrew. In Acts 26, when Paul talks about his encounter with Jesus on the road to Damascus, he says that Jesus spoke to him in the Hebrew language, and Paul understood him. Paul knew Hebrew, and so Paul would also have studied from a much older copy of the Hebrew. And what Paul says in Galatians 3:16 and 17 is consistent with the Greek Septuagint, the Samaritan Pentateuch, and the writings of Flavius Josephus. Now the Bible says, "By the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses every word shall be established." Well, we've got more than 2 or 3 witnesses here. We've got 4 witnesses, all bearing witness that the original Hebrew text said that the Israelites will be in Egypt and Canaan for 430 years. But more than 1,000 years later, when the Hebrew Masoretic text was copied, The phrase "and Canaan" was dropped out of the text, and all of our Bibles are translated from this corrupted copy of the Hebrew. The New King James, the Old King James, the NIV, the NASB, the ESV. If you go to BibleGateway.com, you'll find there's 50 English translations of the Bible on this website, and every single one of them say that the Israelites were in Egypt for 430 years, which is incorrect and mathematically impossible. Every single one of these translations are inconsistent with the original Hebrew because they're all translated from the Hebrew Masoretic, and according to these four witnesses, the Masoretic text copied it incorrectly. As a matter of fact, these ages of Moses and his father and grandfather are recorded in the Masoretic text, and yet they only add up to 350 years maximum. So in that sense, there's even a fifth witness. The Masoretic bears witness against itself. And so the amount of time the Israelites were in Egypt was only 215 years. But the years of slavery was even less than that, because the Israelites did not become slaves until after Joseph and all that generation died, and then a new king arose who did not know Joseph. Well, Joseph was 30 years old when he entered Pharaoh's service. Then shortly after, there were 7 years of abundance and then 7 years of famine. So it would appear that after the 7 years of abundance, Joseph would have been 37 years old. Then 2 years into the famine, when he was 39, that's when all of Israel arrived in Egypt. So based on the information given, it appears as if Joseph was 39 years old at the beginning of that 215 years. Then Joseph died at 110. So take 110 and subtract 39, and that equals 71, which means that for 71 years, the Israelites were in Egypt under Joseph's rule, and they were not slaves during those 71 years. So take the 215 years that the Israelites were in Egypt, subtract the 71 years that Joseph was in power, and that equals 144, which means that the Israelites were not slaves for any longer than 144 years maximum. Now Moses was 80 years old when they left Egypt, and they were already in slavery when Moses was born, which means that they could not have been slaves for any less than 80 years minimum. So take the 215 years that the Israelites were in Egypt, subtract the 71 years that Joseph was in power, subtract the 80 years of Moses' life, and that equals 64, which means that there were 64 years in between Joseph's death and Moses' birth. The Israelites became slaves sometime after Joseph died and sometime before Moses was born, sometime within that 64-year time period. Now let's just assume that the Israelites became slaves at exactly the midpoint in between Joseph's death and Moses' birth. That would be 32 years after Joseph died and 32 years before Moses was born. If this is the case, then that would mean that the Israelites were slaves for 112 years. And so the amount of time the Israelites were in slavery was probably about 112 years or so. Maybe a little bit more, maybe a little bit less, but definitely no more than a maximum of 144, and definitely no less than 80 years minimum. Whatever the case, the Israelites were definitely not slaves for nearly as long as the movies make it sound when they say,
400 years in bondage, and today he won't move.
The Israelites were not slaves for 400 years. They were only slaves for about 112 years or so, plus or minus 32 years.
Also, creation scientists say that the world is about 6,000 years old, but this is based upon the genealogies that are in the Hebrew Masoretic text. But if the original Hebrew text included an extra 650 years of history, then this would take the age of the earth up to at least 6,650, meaning that the world is closer to being 7,000 years old, not 6,000 like creation scientists claim. Now, please don't think that the Greek Septuagint is perfect. It's not perfect. For example, in Genesis chapter 11, you may have noticed that the Greek Septuagint includes an extra Canaan in between Arphaxad and Shelah. The book of Luke chapter 3 in the genealogy of Jesus also includes this extra Canaan in between Arphaxad and Shelah. This extra Canaan does not belong. The oldest known copies of the Greek Septuagint do not include this extra Canaan. Only newer copies do. The oldest known copies of the book of Luke do not include this extra Canaan. Only newer copies do. The Samaritan Pentateuch does not include it. Flavius Josephus does not include it. The Hebrew Masoretic does not include it. Even 1 Chronicles 1:18 does not include it in either the Greek or the Hebrew. This extra Canaan was added in to newer copies of the Greek when it should not have been. So you can just ignore this extra Canaan here. It doesn't belong. And I did not include that extra Canaan in this chart. So in case you're wondering why it's not there, now you know. The question is, though, is why would the Jewish scribes drop those years off of those ages? Why would they do that? Was it on purpose, or was it an accident? And if it was on purpose, then what was their motive? Well, I think that it was on purpose, and I think that their motive was to disprove what the book of Hebrews says about Jesus being the new high priest. You see, the book of Hebrews says that Jesus is the new high priest. Now, any Jewish person knows that in order to be a priest, you have to come from the tribe of Levi. But Jesus didn't come from Levi, he arose from the tribe of Judah, and priests don't come from the tribe of Judah. So, according to the law, Jesus cannot be the new high priest. But the book of Hebrews says that Jesus is the new high priest. Not according to the Levitical priesthood, but according to a different priesthood, according to a higher priesthood, according to the order of Melchizedek. Now, the book of Hebrews says something really interesting about Melchizedek. It says that he had no father and no mother, no genealogy, no beginning of days, and no end of life. Apparently, Melchizedek must be some sort of a divine or immortal being, perhaps like one of the sons of God talked about in Genesis chapter 6. Whatever the case, the book of Hebrews says that Jesus is the new high priest, not according to the fleshly commandment, but according to the power of an endless life. Now, Jewish rabbis have decided that they would disprove what the book of Hebrews says about Melchizedek by claiming that Melchizedek is the same person as Shem, the son of Noah. Now, with Shem, we know who his father and his mother were. It was Noah and his wife. We know what his genealogy is because it's recorded in Genesis. We know he had beginning of days and end of life because we know when he was born and when he died. And so by saying that Shem is the same person as Melchizedek, that would disprove what the book of Hebrews says about Melchizedek. Not only that, but this would mean that Melchizedek is not of a different or a higher priesthood, but rather he would be the ancestral founder of the Levitical priesthood. Rabbis say that Shem handed the priesthood down to Abraham, who then handed it down to Isaac and then to Jacob and eventually down to Levi. This would mean that Melchizedek is of the same priesthood, not a different one. And rabbis say that the only way for Jesus to be the new high priest, according to the order of Melchizedek, is he would have to inherit that priesthood from Levi, just like Levi inherited the priesthood from Melchizedek. But since Jesus is not a descendant of Levi, then Jesus cannot be the new high priest. And this is the argument that Jewish rabbis use even to this day.
Unlike Christianity, our tradition tells us who was Melchizedek. He wasn't an angel or God himself like the Christians teach, but was actually Shem, the son of Noah, who transferred the title of priest over to Abraham and then on through Isaac, Jacob, Levi, and ultimately Aaron.
Now, the problem with this argument, though, is that Melchizedek lived the same time as Abraham. Melchizedek interacted with Abraham. Melchizedek brought out bread and wine to Abraham, and Abraham gave Melchizedek a tithe of all. But Shem died about 500 years before Abraham was even born. How did Shem bring out bread and wine to Abraham when he had been dead for the past 500 years? Clearly, Shem cannot be the same person as Melchizedek. There's about a 500-year gap in there preventing them from being the same person. And so it appears that a long time ago, some Jews decided to conspire with the scribes and have them drop those years off of those ages. That way, they could distort the genealogy in such a way to where the lifetime of Shem now overlaps the lifetime of Abraham. This way, they can say that Shem lived the same time as Abraham and then begin to promote the idea that Shem is the same person as Melchizedek.
It's all an illusion.
Folks, pay no attention to that man behind the curtain.
In fact, if you ever read an article that says that Shem is Melchizedek, you'll notice that the only evidence that they provide is they'll say, look at the genealogy. Shem lived the same time as Abraham. Okay, but where's the rest of the evidence? They might quote the book of Jasher or the Targum or some commentary by a rabbi, but those aren't scripture. Where's the scriptural evidence that clearly says that Shem is Melchizedek? There isn't any. Now, those years were not necessarily dropped out in the 11th century when the Leningrad Codex was copied. They might have been dropped out in an earlier copy of the Masoretic. In fact, they might have been dropped out in a copy of the Hebrew that dates all the way back to the days of Paul the Apostle. And if that's the case, then that might be why Paul warned Titus and Timothy not to get involved in foolish arguments and disputes about genealogies, nor to give heed to Jewish fables. Now, what is Paul talking about here? Why would the Jews want to argue with Christians about genealogies? Maybe it's because they distorted the genealogies in their attempt to disprove Christianity. And maybe that distorted genealogy is the one and only single piece of evidence that even remotely supports this ridiculous anti-Christian fable that Shem is the same person as Melchizedek, and therefore Jesus can't be the new high priest. Maybe that's what Paul was talking about. So you see, not only do we have evidence that those years were dropped out, but now we know of a motive as to why they would want to drop them out. And that's why I suspect that this is not just some accidental copyist error, like when the Greek Septuagint includes an extra Canaan. No, I suspect that the Jewish scribes dropped out those years on purpose, with the intent to deceive.
No, it wasn't me. It was the one-armed man.
All right, I confess. I did it, you hear? And I'm glad. Glad, I tell ya!
As a matter of fact, in 1947, there were some ancient Hebrew scrolls that were discovered in some caves on the outskirts of the Dead Sea, known as the Dead Sea Scrolls. These are hundreds of fragments of ancient Hebrew scrolls that were carefully pieced together and dated all the way back to the 2nd and 3rd centuries BC, more than 1,000 years before the Masoretic text was copied. Now, unfortunately, Genesis chapter 11 was not found in the Dead Sea Scrolls. But whenever the Greek Septuagint and the Hebrew Masoretic text disagree, the Dead Sea Scrolls usually side with the Greek Septuagint more often than with the Masoretic, like in Psalm 145, for example. Paul the Apostle quotes the Old Testament more than 100 times in the New Testament, and whenever the Greek and the Hebrew diverge, Paul usually sides with the Greek Septuagint, like in Galatians 3:17, which I pointed out in a previous video. And not just Paul, but other disciples as well. Take Stephen the Martyr, for example. In Acts 7:14, Stephen the Martyr says that when Jacob and all of Israel went down into Egypt, they consisted of 75 people total. In case you didn't notice, Stephen the Martyr is agreeing with the Greek. You see, in the Hebrew Masoretic text in Genesis 46:27, it says that when Jacob and all of Israel went down into Egypt, they consisted of 70 people total. Exodus 1:5 also says 70 people total. But in the Greek Septuagint, it says that they consisted of 75 people total. Exodus 1:5 also says 75 people total. So which was it? Was it 70 or was it 75? Well, Stephen the Martyr says in Acts 7:14 that they consisted of 75 people total. Stephen the Martyr agrees with the Greek Septuagint, not the Hebrew Masoretic. Now, why would Stephen do that? After all, didn't Stephen know Hebrew? Or did the Hebrew text back then say something different? That's where the Dead Sea Scrolls come in. In 1947, they found these ancient Hebrew scrolls that predate the Masoretic text by more than 1,000 years. And in the Dead Sea Scrolls, they found Exodus chapter 1, verse 5. And guess what it said? It said that Jacob and all of Israel consisted of 75 people total. The Dead Sea Scrolls provide undeniable evidence that when Stephen the Martyr sides with the Greek Septuagint, it's not because he's disagreeing with the Hebrew. It's because he is agreeing with the original Hebrew. Even Jesus himself sides with the Greek Septuagint. In Luke chapter 4, Jesus quotes a passage of scripture from Isaiah 61, where he says, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he has anointed me to preach the gospel to the poor." In this passage of scripture, Jesus uses the phrase, "and recovery of sight to the blind." If you look up Isaiah 61 in the Greek Septuagint, then you'll find that it includes that phrase, "and recovery of sight to the blind." But if you look it up in the Hebrew Masoretic text, then you'll find that that phrase is completely missing from the text. And since all of our Bibles are translated from this corrupted copy of the Hebrew, then all of our Bibles are missing that phrase from Isaiah 61. But even Jesus himself confirmed that it's in the original Hebrew. Even Jesus himself sides with the Greek Septuagint. When atheists say that Egyptian history predates Noah's flood, they think that they're disproving the Bible. But they're not. They're simply pointing out an error in the Hebrew Masoretic text. But even Jesus and his disciples discredit the Masoretic text from time to time. You see, they're assuming that the biblical date for the flood was 2350 BC. But according to these three manuscripts, it's not. So if they're right that Egyptian history predates that, then this actually verifies the testimony of these three manuscripts and therefore confirms the accuracy of the original Hebrew from which Jesus and his disciples were quoting.
There are errors that we know about. Why? Because we can compare the documents, we can compare the manuscripts and see where the errors are. Let's say you have, here's the original, which we don't have. We don't, or at least we don't think we have any original documents, okay? So they're all copies, okay? And let's say you find 4 different copies. And in the first copy, you see an error right here. And then another copy, there's another error right there. In the third copy, there's another error right there. And in the fourth copy, there's an error right there. Can you reconstruct the original?
Yes.
Yes. And that's what scholars do. So yes, sometimes scribe made mistakes, but in virtually all cases, we know what the mistake was, and we can correct it by comparing it with other documents. Now, you might say, why wouldn't God just, if this is true, why wouldn't he just maintain the original? If I had the original, what could I do to it? I could alter it, right? But if you had a copy, 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 and I had a copy, and I changed my copy, is everyone going to know who changed their copy? Yeah, because when you get all your copies together and compare it to mine, you go, Turek, you heretic, why'd you do that? Right? So by not preserving the original, you actually are able to preserve the original better.